was supposed to be an adventure. A cross-country road trip had been on my bucket list for years, and with a week off work and a reliable car, I decided to make it happen. My plan was straightforward. Start in Denver, head west through Utah, dip into Arizona, and loop back up. I had my playlists, a cooler full of snacks, and a detailed itinerary to keep me on track. The first 3 days were perfect. The open road, stunning landscapes, and the solitude were exactly what I needed. I wasn't in a rush, stopping at small diners and tourist traps along the way. My favorite stop so far had been in a tiny town in Utah called Green River. It wasn't much. A main street with a few motels, a gas station, and a diner. But the locals were friendly, and the milkshake I had there was the best I'd ever tasted. On the 4th day, I was driving through the outskirts of northern Arizona. The landscape had shifted from the red rocks of Utah to endless stretches of flat desert. It was beautiful in its own way, but the monotony started to set in. My GPS showed hours of straight roads ahead, and I was starting to feel restless. That's when the detour popped up. A yellow sign ahead read, "Road work ahead. Use alternate route." My GPS recalibrated, showing a winding road that cut through the desert instead of following the main highway. It would shave off about 40 minutes of driving time, and I figured it would add a bit of variety to my route. I took the turn. At first, the road was exactly what I expected. A narrow 2-lane strip of asphalt that snaked through the desert. The scenery was stunning. Towering rock formations, endless skies, and not another car in sight. I rolled down the windows, letting the warm desert air fill the car, and turned up the music. For the first time that day, I felt excited again. About 20 miles in, the road changed. The asphalt turned to gravel, and the path narrowed further. The rocks and cliffs seemed to close in around me, casting long shadows across the road, even though it was still early afternoon. My GPS still showed it as the correct route, so I kept going. I passed a sign that made me pause. It was old, the paint faded and peeling, and it simply said, "No services." Underneath, someone had scratched in the words, "Turn back now." I laughed it off, assuming it was some kind of joke or a relic from the past. But as the miles stretched on, I couldn't help but notice how isolated I was. The sky had grown overcast, and the temperature dropped slightly, the warmth of the day replaced by a cool wind that seemed out of place for the desert. Then I saw the first car. It was pulled off to the side of the road, a rusted old sedan that looked like it hadn't moved in years. The windows were shattered and the tires were completely flat. As I drove past, I noticed the doors were open, and the interior was gutted. There was no sign of anyone nearby. The next 30 minutes felt longer than the entire trip so far. The gravel road seemed endless, twisting and turning without any landmarks or signs. I hadn't seen another vehicle, not even one heading in the opposite direction. My gas gauge dipped lower than I liked, and I realized I hadn't planned for such a remote stretch of road. That's when the second car appeared. It was parked in the middle of the road, blocking both lanes. This one was newer, a white SUV with Arizona plates. The doors were closed, but the hood was up, and steam was rising from the engine. I slowed to a crawl, unsure whether to stop or try to go around. As I inched closer, I noticed a man standing next to the car. He was waving his arms, trying to flag me down. He was wearing jeans and a black hoodie, and his face was partially obscured by the hood. I rolled down my window slightly as I pulled up. "You okay?" I called out. The man nodded, stepping closer to my car. His expression was hard to read, but something about his demeanor made me uneasy. "Yeah, my car broke down. Can you give me a ride to the next town?" I hesitated. Everything about the situation felt off. The road was so remote that the odds of someone breaking down here seemed slim, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't getting the whole story. "Sorry," I said, forcing a polite smile, I'm low on gas myself. I can call for help if you want." The man's expression darkened. "No cell service out here," he said flatly. "Just give me a ride, it's not far." I shook my head, rolling the window up slightly. "Sorry, I can't. Good luck, though." Before he could respond, I pulled around the SUV and accelerated, my heart pounding. In my rearview mirror, I saw him standing in the road, watching me drive away. I drove faster than I should have, the gravel kicking up dust behind me. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles ached. I kept glancing in the mirror, half expecting to see the man's SUV following me. Instead, I saw something worse. A second figure was standing by the side of the road, partially hidden behind a large rock formation. They were motionless, their head tilted slightly as if watching me. I couldn't make out any details, but their presence sent a chill down my spine. The gravel road finally ended, merging back onto a paved highway. Relief washed over me as I saw a small gas station in the distance. I pulled in, parking under the bright lights, and took a deep breath. Inside, the station was empty except for an older man behind the counter. I told him about the detour and the cars I'd seen, hoping for some reassurance. He frowned, shaking his head. "That road's been closed for years," he said. "Washed out by a flood a while back. No one uses it anymore." I stared at him, my stomach sinking. "Then how did those cars get there?" He didn't answer. Instead, he pointed to a bulletin board near the door. It was covered with faded missing persons flyers, at least a dozen of them. "A lot of people disappear out there," he said quietly. "Some roads are better left alone." Road trips were something of a family tradition for me and my older sister, Grace. Growing up, our parents would pile us into the car for long drives, taking us to state parks, quirky roadside attractions, and sleepy towns we would have never seen otherwise. Even as adults, we kept the tradition alive, though it was a little different now. Just the two of us, trading off driving duties and picking random spots to explore. This particular trip was supposed to be a simple 3-day journey from Sacramento to Seattle, where Grace was moving for a new job. She'd loaded up her little Subaru with all her belongings, and I'd tagged along to help her make the drive. We planned to stick to the interstate, but Grace, being her usual spontaneous self, suggested we take smaller highways for part of the trip to make it more interesting. We'd been on the road for about 7 hours when we hit a stretch of Highway 97 in Oregon. It was the kind of road you'd expect from a movie. Long, straight, flanked by endless forests on either side, with barely any other cars in sight. Grace was behind the wheel, and I was half asleep in the passenger seat when she nudged me. "Hey, I need a break. Let's stop at the next rest area," she said. I yawned, stretching, and checked the map. "There's one coming up in about 10 miles. Want me to drive after?" "Sure," she said. "I could use a nap." When we pulled into the rest stop, the sun was just starting to set. The place was nearly empty, except for a single pickup truck parked at the far end of the lot. The building itself was small and nondescript, concrete walls, a metal roof, and a few faded vending machines near the entrance. There were no employees in sight, which wasn't surprising for a place like this. Grace parked near the front and grabbed her bag. "I'll be quick," she said, heading inside. I stayed in the car, scrolling through my phone and sipping the last of my lukewarm coffee. The parking lot was eerily quiet, the only sounds coming from the rustle of leaves and the distant hum of the highway. Something about the stillness made me uneasy, but I told myself it was just the fatigue talking. About 5 minutes later, Grace came back, tossing her bag into the back seat. "Your turn," she said, climbing into the passenger seat. "The bathroom was gross, by the way." I laughed. They usually are. I grabbed my own bag and headed toward the building. The moment I stepped inside, I regretted it. The air was damp and smelled faintly of mildew, and the fluorescent lights overhead flickered sporadically. The hallway leading to the restrooms was lined with cracked tiles and graffiti-covered walls. I hurried to the first open stall, trying not to touch anything more than necessary. As I washed my hands, I noticed a noise coming from outside the building, a faint scraping sound, like something being dragged across concrete. I paused, listening. The sound stopped for a moment, then started again, this time louder. My heart began to race, and I quickly dried my hands, deciding I'd spent enough time in this creepy little building. As I stepped outside, I froze. The pickup truck that had been parked at the far end of the lot was now directly next to our car. The driver's side door was open, and a man was leaning against it, talking to Grace through the window. His back was to me, so I couldn't see his face, but something about his posture felt off. He was too close, leaning into the window like he was trying to block her from getting out. I hurried toward the car, calling out as casually as I could. "Everything okay?" The man straightened up, turning to look at me. He was tall and lanky, with a scruffy beard and sunken eyes. His clothes were dirty, and he smelled faintly of gasoline. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Hey there," he said, his voice low and raspy. "Just chatting with your sister here." Grace gave me a tight smile, her hands gripping the steering wheel. "We're about to head out," she said quickly. "Thanks, though." The man didn't move. He kept his eyes on me, his smile widening. "You sure? I could help you with directions or something. This area can get pretty confusing." "We're good," I said firmly, stepping closer to the car. "Have a good night." He shrugged, stepping back toward his truck. "Suit yourself," he said, climbing into the driver's seat. He didn't start the engine, though. He just sat there, watching us. I climbed into the driver's seat and locked the doors. Grace was already pulling up the GPS on her phone. "What the hell was that about?" I asked, backing out of the parking space. "He was asking if we needed gas or directions," she said, her voice shaking. But he wouldn't leave when I said no. He kept asking weird questions, like where we were headed and if we were alone. I felt a chill run down my spine. Well, we're out of here now. As I pulled onto the highway, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The man's truck was still parked there, his headlights off. He wasn't following us, at least not yet. For the next few miles, Grace and I barely spoke. I kept checking the mirror, half expecting to see those headlights appear behind us, but the road remained dark and empty. Just as I started to relax, Grace gasped. "What happened?" I asked, glancing over at her. "Look," she said, pointing out the window. On the side of the highway, barely visible in the dim light, was the pickup truck. It was parked on the shoulder, its driver's side door open. There was no sign of the man, but the timing felt too perfect. He must have taken another exit and gotten ahead of us somehow. "Keep driving," Grace said, her voice barely above a whisper. I did. My foot pressed harder on the gas, and I kept my eyes glued to the road ahead. A few minutes later, I saw headlights in the distance. For a moment, I thought it was another car, but as the vehicle got closer, I realized it was the same pickup truck. It pulled onto the highway behind us, its headlights flashing briefly before settling into a steady glow. "He's following us," Grace said, her voice trembling. "I know," I said, my hands gripping the wheel. I sped up, but so did the truck. It stayed a few car lengths behind us, matching my speed no matter how fast I went. The road ahead was empty, with no exits or turnoffs in sight. I could feel my heart pounding as I tried to think of a plan. Then, without warning, the truck's headlights disappeared. I glanced in the mirror, but the road behind us was pitch black. I couldn't see the truck anywhere. "Where did he go?" Grace asked, her voice tight with fear. "I don't know," I said, slowing down slightly. "Maybe he turned off." But deep down, I didn't believe it. Something about the way he'd been following us felt calculated, like he was playing a game. We drove for another hour without seeing the truck again. By the time we reached the next town, we were both exhausted and on edge. We decided to stop at a small motel for the night, hoping to put some distance between us and the man. As we pulled into the parking lot, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I glanced around, but the lot was empty, and the motel looked quiet. Still, I double-checked the locks on the car before heading inside. That night I barely slept. Every sound, every creak of the motel's old walls made my heart race. When morning finally came, I felt a wave of relief. We loaded up the car and hit the road again, eager to leave the nightmare behind us. We never saw the man again, but that trip left a mark on both of us. I still think about him sometimes, wondering what his intentions were, and whether someone else wasn't as lucky as we were.